The help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah Daf Yud Zayin. We left off on Daf Yud Zayin, Amud Aleph, 2 lines from the top of the Amud. We're going to first speak about a scenario where Yom Tiv and Shabbos are together. Until now, we were learning about the Yom Tiv that is prior to Shabbos. When Yom Tov falls on Shabbos, there is one question that expresses itself in many halachic questions. The one root question is, how do we view that day? And here are the 2 options. Option number 1 is that there's Shabbos, there's Yom Tov, 2 different Kedushos. It happens to be that they are being celebrated on the same day. But we're celebrating 2 separate things. Or when Shabbos and Yom Tov fall together, they merge and they become one holy day. Shabbos Yom Tov. It's one Kedusha. We had these Lashonas before regarding the 2 days Yom Tov, regarding the 2 days Rosh Hashanah. And we're going to see how this question of, again, is it 2 separate Kedushos? It happens to be happening at the same time, but it's 2 separate things. Or when it's Shabbos Yom Tov, they merge and it's Shabbos Yom Tov. So one example will be that what's the nusach? How do we say the Shemona Esrei? B'chlal, during the week we have 18, now 19 brachas. Shabbos and Yom Tov we only have 7 brachas. The first 3, the last 3 are always the same, but there is the middle bracha. So the question is, on Shabbos Yom Tov, is there only one middle bracha, making the total numbers of blessings of the Shemona Esrei 7? It's Shabbos and Yom Tov. Mention Shabbos and Yom Tov together, or do you make 8 brachas? 1 bracha for Shabbos, 1 bracha for Yom Tov. Because it's like 2 Kedushas. And there are many other expressions in halacha where this question of, is it 1 Kedusha or 2 Kedushas, will have a practical consequence. Now that we're going to be speaking a little bit about Shabbos and Yom Tov, so we know that we add Yalav Yavai, and the question will be, do we add Yalav Yavai in the Ritzei prayer, also known as the Avodah prayer, which is what we do, and it's a machlokes tanoim, or do we add Yalav Yavai as we do Va'al Hanisim in the bracha of Hoida'a, or we can call Moedim. And while we learn it, we'll explain Al Pi Chasidus the huge difference between Ritzei and between Moedim, which will be the underlying machlokes of these tanoim. Now the question will be, when you have a 2-day Yom Tiv, which is common in Chutz La'aretz, so it's Thursday, Friday, and Shabbos, and a person remembers on the first day Yom Tov, which is on Thursday, that they forgot to make an Eid of Tafshilin, or that they forgot to make an Eid of Chatzeros. And we just learned, my friends, the top of the Amid, that we paskin like the version of Rebbe L'Chumra, that you may not place an Eid of Chatzeros on Yom Tov for Shabbos. Well, that's when Yom Tov is Friday. What happens if you are remembering on Thursday that's Yom Tov? And we'll see why that might make a huge difference. Is there a way to make Azamiman of Shach Eruv? Let's not forget that 2 days Yom Tov is really not biblical. 2 days Yom Tov, 1 day is and 1 day is not. At least it began that way. And that might be a way of, yes, being able to establish an Eid of Tafshilin and or an Eruv Chatzeros. We're going to learn a lot about preparing from 1 day Yom Tov to the next day Yom Tov. Again, up until now, we were learning about preparing from Yom Tov to Shabbos. What about from the first day Yom Tov to the second day Yom Tov? We're going to learn more about people that forgot to make an Eid of Tafshilin. We're going to learn about the concept of ha'arama. Ha'arama is like as a subterfuge, a way of you're making a legal loophole. And there are certain times that Chazal felt that a person bemazed violating a rabbinic rule is better than making a ha'arama. I know that sometimes we make haramas, but we'll learn a scenario where they felt if you're trying like to trick the system, we're going to penalize you even more than if you would have just purposefully violated the rabbinic. We're going to finally come back to our Mishnah in the beginning regarding the machlokes Bishamai and Bisilol. How many cooked dishes do you need to have for the Eid of Tafshilin? In the Mishnah we learned that Bishamai said 2, Bisilol said 1. We're going to have another version of that machlokes. And as the sugya will unfold, it will become clear that even though we only spoke about a cooked dish, and even though we learned in the last daf that bread cannot be used for the Eid of Tafshilin to allow you to prepare cooked dishes. But actually, we're going to learn the Tosfos that we paskin that an Eid of Tafshilin must consist of a cooked dish and of a baked food. Michalek and matzah. Basically, any type of food that you plan to prepare for Shabbos, you need to have from that type in your Eruv Tafshilin. If you only want to cook food for Shabbos, if you don't plan to bake food for Shabbos, then you don't have to have a pas. But if you plan on Yom Tov, Friday Yom Tov, to prepare both cooked dishes and to prepare baked items, then you have to have in your Eruv Tafshilin both cooked and baked. And actually there's another type of food preparation known as hatmana. We're going to learn about that on Daf Chav Beis, but we'll see how that also touches upon the Eruv Tafshilin. Now, if we'll have time in today's Daf, and Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis at the end, we're going to learn the second, we're going to start a new Mishnah, and the Mishnah is going to be in the opposite case. What happens when Yom Tov is on Sunday? Up until now, we're learning Yom Tov Friday, or Yom Tov Thursday, Friday, a lot of that in today's Daf. What happens if Yom Tov is going to be on Sunday? And therefore, what will be the question? Are there any things that we can do on Shabbos for Yom Tov? For example, we'll begin with going to the mikvah. Chayv Adam l'tayr atzmai beregel. There's an inyan to go to the mikvah prior to Yom Tov. Can you go to the mikvah on Shabbos? Or if you have a utensil that's impure, that's tamei, can you take it to the mikvah on Shabbos for Yom Tov? And a lot more. Let's get rolling. We are on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. We are 2 lines from the top of the Amud. Tanach Rabbanan. So here, as we spoke on in the intro, we're not speaking about Yom Tov Erev Shabbos. We're not speaking about Yom Tov post Shabbos, which will be at the end of today's daf, but Yom Tov and Shabbos on the same day. Shabbos Yom Tov. Tanach Rabbanan Yom Tov Shchal Liyas b'Shabbos. Machloikas. Beishamai oimrim mispalol shmoina. Mispalol shmoina means normally the number of blessings is 7. The first 3 and the last 3 don't change. The middle 12 is removed. The middle 12 that we say on the weekday, and it's replaced with only 1. Says Beis Shammai, if it's Shabbos Yom Tov, you replace it with 2. 1 only for Shabbos, 1 only for Yom Tov. In other words, they don't view Shabbos Yom Tov as one kedusha. It's 2 separate things. V'omer shel Shabbos b'fnei atzma and v'shel Yom Tov b'fnei atzma. However, Beis Hillel oimrim nish mispalel sheva. And in this one bracha, maschil b'shel Shabbos, u'mishayim b'shel Shabbos, you begin speaking about Shabbos. You end speaking about Shabbos. And v'oimer kedushas hayoim in middle of the middle bracha. Rebbe, who follows the shita of Beis Hillel, he adds to Beis Hillel. And he says, you only make 7 brachas. You always begin with mentioning Shabbos. You always begin, and by the way, that's the way we do it. How do we begin the middle brach? V'titel lanu Hashem Elokeinu es yoim. If it's Shabbos, we mention Shabbos first. Look inside the top Rashi, 4 or 5 lines from the top of the Amud. The nusach of Rashi is yoim hamenucha zeh. I think we say Shabbos is limenucha. Anyway, as yoim hamenucha zeh and ves yoim chag ploini hazeh. So Rebbe adds back in the Gemara that you close the final words formulation of the bracha of the middle one is also Mekadesh HaShabbos Yisrael V'Hazman. I think we have a vav, right? We say Mekadesh HaShabbos V'Yisrael V'Hazman. Okay, says the Gemara Tanach Kamei Ravina that the Rebbe didn't say Mekadesh HaShabbos Yisrael V'Hazmanim, but there was another version where Rebbe added that you say Mekadesh Yisrael, then v'hashabbos, and then v'hazmanim. Now let's understand that the reason why Yisrael is mentioned altogether, why don't we just say Mekadesh HaShabbos v'hazmanim, Shabbos and Yom Tov? And the answer is because it is the Jewish people, we are the ones that bring Kedusha to Yom Tov. Because without us establishing the calendar, then there would not be a Yom Tov. You wouldn't know what day of the month it is for it to be Yom Tov. So the Mekiddush of the Zmanim has to do with the Yidden. Now, according to the second version, where you say Mekadesh Yisrael even before Shabbos, that would imply that the Kedusha of Shabbos is also dependent on, it comes from Yisrael. But that's a problem. So Amalei, that version cannot be correct. Otu Shabbos, as far as Shabbos is concerned, the Kedusha of Shabbos is Yisrael Mekachile. We make it holy. The 7th day is automatically the 7th day. You don't need to have a people determining when the 7th day is. For Shabbos Mekacha V'Kaima. Unlike Yom Tov. And therefore, it must be the first version is correct, that what did Rebbe say? He added to Beis Hillel. You also make the chasim of the bracha speaking about Shabbos and Yom Tov both. Ella, Ema Mekadesh HaShabbos. and then v'Yisrael v'Hazmanim. And just to explain the version, the reason why we do have one version that says Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hashabbos v'Hazmanim is because Shabbos is Mekadesh v'Kaima, but we add to the Kedusha of Shabbos. Okay, right. Amar Rabbi Yosef, I want you to know that Allah is like Rebbe, but which version? Uketadetz Ravina, that Shabbos, right, is mentioned dafka before Yisrael, not Mekadesh Yisrael v'Shabbos v'Hazmanim, but yes, Mekadesh HaShabbos Yisrael v'Hazmanim. Says the Gemara Tana Rabbanan, Shabbos Chaliyos b'Rosh Chodesh or b'Chol Shomayit. Let's move on to Inyan Le'inyan. Not Shabbos Yom Tov, but Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. Shabbos Chol HaMoed. Mamash, this is what we do. So there's a big difference between Musaf and Arvis, Shachris, and Mincha. By Arvis, Shachris, and Mincha, it's Shabbos, you daven, ordinary Shabbos davening, Sheva. And not only that, not only like Beis Hillel, but we don't mention inside this, the middle bracha, anything about Rosh Chodesh, anything about Chol HaMoed. Taka, by Ma'ariv, by Shachris, and by Mincha, where do we mention Chol HaMoed or Rosh Chodesh? Yalav V'Yavai. Yalav V'Yavai, we add it in Ritzei. Ritzei is part of the three final brachas. Or let's take a quick step back, the formulation of Shemona Esrei, as it was finally at the end established by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, and we were reminded of it by Shimon HaManusi, I think, as we had in brachas, is that you begin with three of Shevach, and by the way, now we are learning this during the Aseret Yimei Tshuva. The problem of the three of Shevach was if the first three brachas have no requests in it, it needs to be explained. Why is it that during the Aseret Yimei Tshuva, Zochreinu L'chaim is something that's mentioned in the beginning? That's not a statement of praise to God, that's a request. But the formulation is you don't begin asking. First you begin praising. Then you have the middle brachas that are of requests during the week, or about the Kedusha of the day during Shabbos and Yom Tov. And then you have three final brachas that are called brachas of thanksgiving. And that's Ritzei, Moedim, and Sim Shalom. And here also it has to be explained. It doesn't sound exactly like Sim Shalom is not a bracha of requests. It sounds like it is a request. We're asking for God to place peace, and that's the biggest of requests. Classical questions that we don't have time to speak about right now. But we add Yalav V'Yavai not in the middle one. Where do we add it? So he says, V'oimer me'ein ha'ma'oira, whether it's Rosh Chodesh, whether it's Chol HaMoed, we're ba'avoida, what we call it, say. Now, V'im lo yamar, weiter machzirin oisai, we make the person repeat. Sometimes you only have to go back to the tzei with all of the pratim. We have everything written in the Siddur today, in the English. Sometimes you have to say the whole Shemona Esrei. There are many details that we're not going to go into. We learned, Chevra, that if Ma'ariv Rosh Chodesh, not Ma'ariv Chol HaMoed, Ma'ariv Rosh Chodesh, if you forget Yalav V'Yavai, you b'chlal don't have to repeat the Shemona Esrei. So there's a lot of nuances to this statement, but we're going to focus on the Nakuda, that where do you add the mention of the Yom, let's say, and Avodah. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. He does agree that it's not mentioned in the middle one. It's not mentioned in the middle one. But it's not mentioned in the Tzei, it's mentioned in the second to last one. The way we add Ala Nisim. Now, just a bekitzer, this is a theme that we learn a lot in Chassidus. There are three brachas that really speak about prayer. Shema Koleinu. Ritzei, the avodah should be accepted with ahava. It's also about prayer and moedim. These three brachas are connected to Tefilla, but here are the words. There are different levels of prayer. Shema Koleinu refers to the deepest type of prayer. And then between Ritzei and Hoidah, Ritzei is still a prayer that's coming from Regesh, that's coming from Ahava. And Moedim is a prayer that is being uttered by someone who doesn't have Regesh, but by someone who has Mesiras Nefesh. And Chassidus always emphasizes that it's normally one or the other. Normally, the more Regesh you have, the less capacity you have to go on Mesiras Nefesh. On the other hand, when you lose your Regesh, and all we have is action, then we overcompensate by going ad Mesiras Nefesh. which is the concept of moedim. Moedim means I'm moedim. I don't feel it, I don't get it, but I'm doing it. I'm moedim to you, God. And generally, Ritzei is connected to the avodah that the Yidden have during the times of the Beis Hamikdash, and Hoida'a Mesiras Nefesh is connected to Golus. Dafke because no regesh, we had more Mesiras Nefesh, which is why Chanukah and Purim, which is Yomim Tovim of Mesiras Nefesh, for sure are mentioned in Hoida'a. Question is, the mention of Rosh Chodesh, the mention of Yomim Tovim, and they are connected somehow to the Beis Hamikdash because special korbanos were brought. So that's the question. Is it connected to Ritzei? Is it expected of us to have a regish that it's Rosh Chodesh, a regish that it's Chol HaMoed, or fakert now that we know in the times of Galus, is it more connected to Haidah? That's a very meaningful machlokes, but let's go on over here. However, says the Beitzah, Ubim Musafim, Maschel B'Shol Shabbos, Umeshayim B'Shol Shabbos. On Musaf, we do add the mention of Rosh Chodesh during the middle prayer, which is exactly what we do, right? Ata Yetzarta, for example. Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh. And V'omer Kedushas Hayoim Be'emtza. Says the Gemara, says the Beitzah weiter, Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shmuel ben Yeshua, they argue with the Tanach. Both Shitos hold that not Musaf. Arvis, Shachris, and Mincha, whether it's Hoida'a or Ritzei, it's not mentioned in the middle one. But these two Tanoim hold that Kol Mokim Shuskak L'Sheva, whenever it's only a 7 prayer, Shabbos Yontiv, then Maschel B'Shel Shabbos, Umeshayim B'Shel Shabbos, and you don't add Ayala V'Yovei by Ritzei. No, you mention Rosh Chodesh, you mention Chol HaMoed in the middle one. We don't pass in that way. But that's these two shittas. Ramanafuna, indeed, ein halacha ke oisoi hazug v'ayin tois, more details. Okay, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Amar Rab Chia bar Ashi Amarav, maniach Adam eruvei techumen v'yomtiv lechaveroi umasne. Here, like we mentioned in the intro, we're speaking about 2 days Yomtiv, Chutz La'aretz, and the person forgot to make an Eruv Tavshilin, or a person forgot to make an Eruvei Techumen. Let's go with those who say that you may not place them. Eruv Techumen, we learned everyone is Moedi, you can't place an Eruv Techumen on Yomtiv. But here you didn't remember on Friday, you remembered on Thursday, that's Yomtiv. So here there's a solution. Place the Eruv Techumen and make the following stipulation. What's the following stipulation? Let's talk it out. I'm going to put my Eruv in the place that will help me go another more distance for Shabbos. I'm placing it for Shabbos. I'm doing it on Thursday. And I say like this, if today is really not Yom Tov, because Yom Tov is only 1 day, so therefore today is Erev Yom Tov, so what I'm placing now is the Eruv Techumen. If today is Yom Tov, what I'm doing now is nothing. Don't forget, guys, on Yom Tov you can carry food. I'm doing nothing wrong with carrying food or placing. I'm doing nothing. Then you come back tomorrow and you take the same food and you pick it up and you place it again. And you say, if yesterday was a weekday, so then it was already placed yesterday. If yesterday was Yom Tov, then today's a weekday. If today's a weekday, I'm making my Eruv Techumen today. By Eruv Tavshilin, it's similar but not exactly the same. By Eruv Tavshilin, here's like this. If Thursday is Yom Tov, right, then Friday is not Yom Tov. Then you don't need an Eruv Tavshilin. That's the word. But what you're saying Thursday is that if really tomorrow is Yom Tov, today is Erev Yom Tov, then this is the Eruv Tavshilin. Even though we learned a few daf ago that nowadays, right, we have to keep 2 days, even though we know when the 15th of the month is, it doesn't matter. But since it originated from this suffix, so we get to use the leniency of the concept of, it's not Yom Arichta, it's either 1 day or the other day. Yes, Midrabanan, we have to keep 2 days, and it's that important. It's the end of the world, God forbid, to be mezalzel in Yom Tov Sheni, but we still view it as suffix, which allows us this stipulation. As we learned above, again, the only difference will be is that by Eruv Techumen you have to place it twice, and by Eruv Tavshilin you only place it on Thursday, and you say that what? That if tomorrow is Yom Tov, this is my Eruv Tavshilin, and then on Friday you don't have to do anything. Because if Taka Friday was Yom Tov, you already have the Eruv Tavshilin. If Thursday was Yom Tov, then Friday is Stama weekday for this. And Stama weekday out of Shabbos, you prepare food on Friday for Shabbos. You don't eat on Eruv. Says the Gemara.
Can you explain how it fits with what we just spoke earlier, that we don't do Eruv Tchumen?
We don't do Eruv Tchumen. Yeah. But that's the beauty. We don't do Eruv Tchumen on a day that's Vaday Yom Tov. But here we're speaking about a 2 days Yom Tov, and this person didn't wake up on Friday, they woke up on the first day Yom Tov on Thursday. So we are allowed to view 2 days Yom Tov still as an extension of a doubt, and make use of that doubt by saying, I don't know really, I really don't know. So if today is Yom Tov, then what I'm doing now is nothing. I'm not allowed to place an Eruv Tchumen today. But come back tomorrow and place it tomorrow.
So the difference there is that it was a 1 day Yom Tov.
That's correct. Yes. Okay. Now, don't forget over here that it was Rav that spoke about the Eruv Tchumen, and it was Rava that spoke about the Eruv Tavshilin. Now, does one agree with the other? So it's only a one-way street. It's not a two-way street. Says the Gemara, man, the Amar Eruv Tchumen, or it's late, we got to move. If you can make a stipulation for Eruv Tchumen, then for sure, Kol Shchen Eruv Tavshilin. However, man, the Amar Tavshilin, he will hold Aver Tchumen loy. Why does it make sense to be more lenient on Eruv Tavshilin more than Eruv Tchumen? Because the lemikne shvisa b'shapsa loy. Because even though it began with the doubt, let's not forget, on the other hand, that Chazal established it as a 2 day Yom Tov. And any type of placement of Eruv is making some sort of act of acquisition, which normally may not be done for Yom Tov. So we are opening up a kula. When do we open up a leniency? When it comes to food preparation. If you won't allow an Eruv Tavshilin, like the blind men from last daf, you'll be depressed, you won't have food. Not having food on Yom Tov is a much greater loss to Simchas Yom Tov than you not being able to walk beyond the Tchum. Nishka Frelach. So it's not so simple. In other words, I stand corrected. Correct. In other words, there's Simchas Shabbos of the lack of Simchas Shabbos. You won't eat. Lack of Simchas Shabbos because you can't walk as far as you want. The latter is not as important, and we don't say it's a suffix. We have to be very careful. People who hear this, they say, if it's a suffix, then God forbid they can be mezalzel in Yom Tov Sheni. Okay. Tana Rabbanan. Let's move. Ein oifim Yom Tov l'chaveiroi. Very important. Until now we were speaking about the Yom Tov for Shabbos. What about Yom Tov to Yom Tov? Can you prepare food on Thursday for Friday when 2 days are Yom Tov? Says the Beitzah, no. Be'emes amru, mamale isha kol hakdeira basar, that if a woman is making a preparation and she's not exerting herself more at all, she's allowed to prepare food for Thursday, on Thursday for Thursday. So she can already fill up the pot with meat, even though and she knows that the leftover meat will be for Friday, tomorrow, Yom Tov. That's not a problem. You begin with the premise that you may not prepare from one day Yom Tov to the other. But here, exception number one is, if the exertion that you are doing now won't be greater for tomorrow, it's the same work anyways, then you are allowed to add for tomorrow. Similarly, you're filling up a barrel of water. They used to boil water. They would knead with boiled water, even though you only need 1 keton for today, because you're not adding work. It's the same work. However, what about putting bread in the oven, taking bread out of the oven? There, every placement and removal is an extra work. But to actually put it in the oven and then take it out when it's ready, you can only do for what you need on that day and not for the next day. And on that, Rab Shimon ben Elazar argues, and he says even that is allowed to be done. Why? You are making extra work, right, to put it in and to take it out. Like in those days, the ovens were smaller. The more packed it is, the hotter it got, or the less circulation, which was beneficial. So since having more loaves of bread makes today's bread tastier, you are allowed to fill it up even though you know that the majority of the breads are going to be used tomorrow and not for today. And Amar Rava, we are allowed to be lenient, that halacha can abshur men alazar. Basically, we have two exceptions, which comes out in halacha. Number one, again, is that if the preparation of additional food is not adding to any avodah, you are allowed to do it. And number two, even if you're doing extra work, but it's for the benefit of today's food, here also you will be allowed to do it. Listen to this inquiry. And we're going to have various, very beautiful, nuanced inquiries. A person who did not leave Erev Tafshilin, is the pshat that only hu nesar, is that person prohibited baking or cooking food on Yom Tov to Shabbos? But it's not only that this person is prohibited, but the kimchai nesar, his flour, his foods are also prohibited. Meaning, can another person use his flour? Reuven forgot to make an Erev Tafshilin. Can Shimon take Reuven's flour and make food for Reuven? If it's only an isur on the gavra, that will be our words, Reuven did not make an Erev Tafshilin, so Reuven cannot prepare food on Yom Tov for Shabbos. But if Reuven's foods are not prohibited, he cannot cook, but his neighbor can use Reuven's food for Reuven. Right?
The neighbor he did make a Erev Tafshilin, is that what we're saying? But Reuven didn't?
The neighbor made an Erev Tafshilin, but Danny, we're not speaking about the neighbor using the neighbor's food. That's not a problem. We're speaking about, can Shimon use Reuven's flour for Reuven? And the first option is no. V'kim choy nesar. Now there will be a way around it. The way around it will be, will Reuven have to bequeath? Can Shimon acquire that flour? Then you'll be good. But will that step have to happen? Or ein kimchoy nesar? Or no? Or Reuven didn't make an Erev Tafshilin, Reuven cannot cook for himself. But you, the neighbor, you can take Reuven's flour and make food for Reuven without having to do anything. And lamay nafkemina, la'aknuye kimchoy la'chedim. I want you to know, Bachlal, guys, making any kinyan on Yom Tov is prohibited midrabanan. We know that. We also know, we just came off Masechta Sukkah, for example, that l'tzoyrech mitzvah, a kinyan could be made. And we're going to learn more about buying food on Yom Tov for Yom Tov is allowed. Tzorech mitzvah. I'll give you the best example from Sukkah, that if I don't have the arba minim, you gift me your arba minim on Yom Tov. But that's an act of kinyan. It belonged to you, and I pick it up, and now it belongs to me. No, let's make it clear that any act of kinyan, which is normally asan midrabanan, is allowed on Yom Tov l'tzoyrech mitzvah. Eating food on Shabbos and on Yom Tov is a tzorech mitzvah. So here, if we need to, we can have this loophole. Do we need to? In other words, if the kemach of Reuven becomes aser, then an act of kinyan will have to happen. Once an act of kinyan happened, we'll be good. In other words, Shimon will own the flour. Shimon is making food for his neighbor Reuven. That's for sure not a problem. In other words, im amrat hu nesar and v'kimchay nesar, then tzorech la'aknuya kimcha la'chedim. It will be permitted, but you'll have to do that step. But the im amrat only hu nesar v'kimcha nesar, then there's no need for then loy tzorech la'aknuya kimcha la'chedim. Simply, the neighbor can take Reuven's flour and make food for Reuven. So these are the two sides of the inquiry with the nafkamina. And now, what's the din? Says the Gemara, Tashema, we're quoting a Beitzah. Says, Mishlein Yecharuv Tafshilin, Hareze lo yoife. He may not bake. Lo yavashel, he may not cook. Lo yatmin, he may not insulate. Let's leave Hatmana to Daf Chav Beis. We're almost there. And for those who learn Masechta Shabbos, for those who remember, we're going to speak about insulation, how it might be problematic. And here again, if you made an Eruv Tafshilin, you won't have an issue of insulating something on Friday for Shabbos, but this person didn't do it. He forgot. Not only v'loy loy, but also loy la'achedim. All right? That's what Danny mentioned before. In other words, for Shimon to be allowed to cook for the Uva and make it clear, forget about kinyan, no kinyan. If I didn't make an Eruv, not only may I not prepare for me, I may not prepare for you. And now what we are talking about is the next statement. If I forgot to make an eruv, you cannot make it for me. Now, how will I have food? So, clear. I have to gift my raw materials to my neighbor who did make an eruv, and then clearly that who nesar and the kimchoy nesar indeed shmamino. Next, what happens if a person who forgot to make an eruv tafshilin, prepared food, he baked food from Friday to Shabbos. In other words, do we say it's as a isar gavra, but the food remains permitted, or you broke this rabbinic? Now the food is prohibited. So Tashema Nachmal from Abraisa Mishaloi Hiniacheru v'Tafshilin Keitzad Hu Oises. Again, we just quoted Makne Kimchei Lachedim, and then Vachedim Oifen Loi Umavashlim Loi Baruch Hashem Daf Yud Zayin Amid Beis. Now the Braisa is giving you a solution. Be makna your raw material to someone else who made an eruv. Now ve'im isa, if after the fact, right, doctor? Post facto, if the din will be that may be used, why didn't the Braisa also mention litnei avar v'afar muter? The Braisa is trying to give you scenarios where you have a solution. Why didn't we mention that after the fact you can eat it? The fact that it's not mentioned, l'chayras infer from this that post facto you may not eat it. So the Gemara says that's not a raya. Amar Avada bar Masna, maybe post facto you could. Why didn't the Tana mention it? Tana takanta de teirektani and takanta yisura lektani. He's not going to mention something that post facto was for sinning. And being makna kimcha is alachatchila. Okay, so we don't have a proof. So let's go weiter. Tashema, another braisa, mishel hiniach eruv tafshilin, only then hareza oyif and umavashel and umatmin. And furthermore, if you want to eat your eruv on Yom Tiv, then you are allowed. Now, if you ate it before you prepared the food for Shabbos, then you won't have an eruv. But you are allowed to eat it. You are allowed to eat it, but if you ate it before you finish preparing, here again, now that I don't have an eruv, I can't cook for me. I can't cook for you. And you, the neighbor, with my food, you cannot prepare for me, as we just learned above. However, even in this scenario where I have no eruv, I can be mavashal for today, for Yom Tov. And ve'im oiser Shabbos. And if there's leftovers, that was the beginning of this Pedic. We learned this in the Mishnah. No problem. But in this scenario, Chazal were against someone doing an act of ha'arama, of tricking the system. Sometimes we are allowed to do it. Here we're not allowed to do it. If you remember in the first chapter, just for example, to contrast, if a person shechted an animal on Yom Tov, being that we're not allowed to be ma'abed the hides, you remember that? But there's a tremendous loss. Maybe people are going to hesitate. So remember that I can roast, I can salt meat that I'm going to roast on top of the hide. Like all these things are called haramas. Here the Chazal were very strict, shelo yarim. And not only that, but ve'im herim, and I want to be good with God, and I'm being honest, that I really knew that I don't need all that food. I really did it for Shabbos. After the fact, it's asr. Oh, so that is that if a ha'arama after the fact is asr, then baking and cooking also should be asad after the fact. And Amar Avashi, again, no proof. Harama ka'amrat. It's very different. Shani harama, listen to these words. This is such an important statement. The achmiru bar abanan tfei mimezit. There is a place to say that if a person bimezit violated the rule and they prepared on Yom Tov for Shabbos, it's less problematic than a person who was trying to do an act of subterfuge, of ha'arama. Narstu, what the Rebbe Rashab says, you're only fooling yourself. Is then a chachma, a nar, not an anar, or something like that? No, don't trick, don't make tricks. But mezid is less problematic than making a trick. So again, there's no proof.
Do these halachas apply also for a guy that cooked on Yom Tov for a year?
Well, there's an issue of a guy cooking b'chlal. correct, bishul akum. Let's not forget about that. I'm assuming tzamach, I have to look at this, these are dinim and Shulchan Aruch, that if I did not make an eruv tafshilin, then a goy can no way cook for me. Goy cannot do for me what I cannot do for me.
Assuming there was a flame that I lit before Yom Tov.
So I'm saying there's no way that a goy can do something for me that I cannot do for me. That's the whole amira la'akum issue. Or it's a goy can do for me what I can do for me. I can sweep the floor. I can hire a goy to sweep the floor. Today, that the floors you can sweep. Can't have a goy working for me doing something that I cannot do. Okay. Again, so we're trying to resolve this inquiry. Homani. No, Rav Nachman Yitzchak is giving another reason why you can't prove anything from this Beitzah that's so machmer that says that if you did an act of harama, asur. Because I will argue that who is the author of this Beitzah that's very chamor? Maybe it's only Hananya that follows Beishamai Tanya Hananya Omer Beishamai Omerim Ein Oifen Ela Imkein Erev Bepas. A detail that we never mentioned inside, but we mentioned it in the intro, that Eruv Tafshilin really has to have from every food for every food. If you want to be able to bake, you have to designate prior to Yom Tov a baked product. Furthermore, we're going to speak about Atmana and Daf Chav Beis. If you want to be allowed to do an act of Atmana on Friday, you have to begin by doing Atmana Erev Yom Tov. In other words, every manner of food preparation has to be represented in the Eruv Tafshilin. We paskin this way. And Beis Hillel says Ma'arav Tafshil Echad, and that's enough called Sarkoi. So since we see that Chananya Beishamai is more machmer, I would argue Lashita of the Machmirim, there imherim asur. But we don't paskin, we can paskin like Beis Hillel. If we paskin like Beis Hillel, we can be more lenient. Another reason why you can't bring a raya, so we're back to without, and the Gemara actually leaves this inquiry unresolved. Whether im afa v'bishel b'mezid, whether the isur is an isur only gavra, or whether that it extends. Oh, we're not done. Let's go weiter. So the question is still open. So says the Gemara now, Tanan, a attempted proof. Here we're quoting a Mishnah in Terumos. If a person separates tithings on Shabbos, which as we know is asur midrabanan, it's called an act of tikkun, even though it's not discernible, but nevertheless it may not be done. So now that you did it, now what? Says the Mishnah, depends. If you separated Terumos b'shoigeg, meaning you forgot it Shabbos, or you forgot that you may not separate Terumos, then you can eat it. But if b'mezid, since you violated only a rabbinic after the fact, lo yoichal, so the same thing should be over here, l'chayra, that if you didn't have an Eruv Tafshilin and you ended up cooking, it should depend. B'shoigeg, yes, b'mezid not. Says the Gemara, no, loy. That the reason why over there in Terumos the Mishnah says that b'mezid lo yoichel, because you have other foods, and therefore we have the luxury of saying you did it b'mezid, we're going to penalize you. Over here, maybe if you don't have any other ways other than cooking, then after the fact you can eat it. Okay, so Tashima, it says Hamat bil kelev b'Shabbos, if a person toivels kelev on Shabbos, and here again, and we're going to learn this soon in the Mishnah, that's asur midrabanan. So can you use the kelev? So the Mishnah says again, b'shoigeg you can use it, b'mezid you can't use it. So l'chayda the same thing should be over here. If you violated the rabbinic law, post facto, could you not use it? It depends, b'shoigeg or b'mezid. And again, the Gemara says you can't necessarily connect one with the other. Loi. Maybe the Mishnah there tzricha. When do we have the luxury to penalize the violator b'mezid, the islay mana achrine, because he has other utensils? Or even if you don't have other utensils, but you can borrow utensils from your neighbors. Food, people then didn't have that much food. Maybe if you don't have food, maybe even b'mezid, you'll be allowed to eat it. Weiter. Tashima, another attempted proof. This is from the Mishnah. This Mishnah is very complex, but we're going to leave it simple. That hamavashal b'Shabbos, if someone cooks on Shabbos, b'shoigeg yoichal, b'mezid lo yoichal. If you remember, it's really a three-way machlokes tanoim. Oh, this is a sugya, that's wow. But same point. B'mezid lo yoichal. Here, the Gemara doesn't even have to resort to what it said until now. Here we can argue that even if there is no other food, don't forget cooking on Shabbos is a violation of a Isur D'Oraisa. There it makes a lot more sense to be machmer. Says the Gemara B'chlal, you can't compare one case to the other. Isur de Shabbos Shani. Here, Isur de Shabbos meaning it's a biblical violation, and Noch Shabbos, Isur Skila. Here we're speaking about a rabbinic violation, and then, yes, correct, this is a boya, that is a boya de loy ifshata, whether after the fact you can benefit from that food or not. Let's go weiter. We had in the Mishnah, how much cooked items do you need to do? Beishamai oimnim shnei tafshilin. Beis Hillel says 1 tafshil. Says the Gemara Nachamal, this is I think the third time that we have this in this Masechta, that in the Mishnah, Machlokes Beishamai and Beis Hillel, and we have Reb Shimon ben Elazar that had another version of their Machlokes. So Masnis said, the Tanya, Amr ben Elazar, I want you to know that Moedim Beishamai and Beis Hillel, Al Shnei Tafshilin, that you need to have 2 tafshilin. Where is their machlokes regarding the detail that the Mishnah gave, that someone prepared dago beitzah sha'alav, you broiled a fish in eggs? Do we view this like 2 tafshilin? That Beishamai oimrim, they're machmir here, and they say since you need to have 2 tafshilin, and now that you mix the fish is fried in the egg, it's considered 1 tafshil. And Beis Hillel oimrim, that what? When they said the words tafshil echad, what they really meant is that what we call 1 tafshil, halachically is 2 tafshilin. So you can use it. But everyone agrees that you have to have lechatchila 2 tafshilin. And now v'shavin, another detail, it's not that you broiled the fish in the egg. But if you mashed up a egg and you put it inside the fish, that l'kula or sherisek, kaflutois, if you minced vegetables and you place it inside the fish, you stuffed it, tzamach to cook, that's shnei tafshilin. And therefore, even Beishamai will be moided that this is enough. But the point is, faket l'chumra, that his version is that Beis Hillel holds you need to have 2 tafshilin. Says the Gemara.
Are we not using the version that we learned before that Beishamai requires 1 type of food for every type of thing that you're able to, like bread for bread or
that's not. In other words, this B'rai says even for cooked dishes, you have to have 2 cooked dishes. And according to his version, if Beis Hillel says it, that would have been the halacha. However, Amar Rava, that the halacha follows our Tana's version like Beis Hillel. It's very important. That 4 cooked dishes, you need to have only 1 cooked food. Now let's go back. We did have a machlok, right? We did have another Beishamai and Beis Hillel. So when we read these words, you would think for paskening like Beis Hillel, then 1 cooked should be good for baking also. So look inside Chavra, the 3rd Tosfos. That Amar Rav Hilchas Ketana Kama V'Alibah Beis Hillel, Perish Rashi V'Alibah Beis Hillel to comment Tafshil Echad. That this is only for this topic, but for the prior topic, the la'afiyah, guys, we paskin like this, Rabbeinu Tam. Tzorech la'arev gam bepas. Ve'enu yochel la'efois al eruv tafshil. No, you only have to have 1 tafshil, but we do paskin. Tafshil is for cooked. For baking, you have to have, and that's what we do is we take a tafshil and we take baked challah or matzah, I don't care, baked. And now we have a proper 8 of tafshilin. Let's go weiter. It's late.
To go according to everyone, you would do 2 tafshilin and then 2 baked goods, and then you would cover Beishamai and Beis Hillel.
L'chayra. What Danny is saying is, l'chayra, according to Beishamai, number 1 you have to have for baked. Since he says 2 tafshilin, he's saying l'chayra you need to have 2 baked items. Probably. Okay. Says, let's go weiter. What did we learn in the Mishnah? Referring back to the Mishnah, achaloi, if your eruv that you set aside was eaten, or if it was lost, so then the Mishnah says, harei loy yivashel olav, you can't use it for the eruv tafshilin. So Amar Rabbi, and we keep on emphasizing, that means that even if you began to prepare, if you didn't finish preparing, you're not good. There is one exception. Amar Rabbi, naktinan, we have the following Kabbalah, that if you began preparing a dough, and while you began, you had the eruv, and now v'nechal eruva, even before the item is finalized by bread, we can be lenient. Here we can be goymer. And by the way, goyim only that loaf of bread. Only that loaf of bread. But there's a certain leniency that we made for bread, l'chu'ura, connected to what we learned above, that the more important it is, the more we can be lenient. And we're speaking about the most staple of foods. Imagine a Yid won't even have bread. So for that, if he began, we don't say that you have to first finish and then eat. Even if you began, it's good enough. Let's start learning the new Mishnah. So what did we have? It's beautiful. We learned Yom Tov Erev Shabbos. Then we learned Yom Tov on Shabbos. Then we learned 2 days Yom Tov before Shabbos. And now we're introducing something new. What happens if Yom Tov is after Shabbos? Now, you're not going to bake on Shabbos for Yom Tov. You can't bake on Shabbos, period. But there are other actions that one might do on Shabbos, which will be for the benefit of Yom Tov. Here also, we want to know whether there is an issue, whether there's a non-issue. So says the Mishnah. Chal liyois achar Shabbos. We're learning Masechtas Yom Tov. So we're speaking about Yom Tov. Chal liyos means if Yom Tov falls out on achar Shabbos, which is what we call Sunday, Yom Rishon LaShabbos, Beishama Yoimrim, Matbilen es hakoil melifnei HaShabbos. If you have things that have to be toivled, both kalim, if you have kalim that are tamei, and people. Now, a person is not necessarily if the person is tamei, but here's we will introduce the concept that Rashi says that chayiv. I'm looking inside the first line in Rashi under the Gemara that chayiv l'tayir es atzmoi beregel. There's an inyan of going to the mikveh before Yom Tov. So normally you would go out of Yom Tov. But now with Shabbos, says Beishamai, you may not go to the mikvah on Shabbos. It has to be Melifnei Shabbos. Melifnei Shabbos. Now look inside Rashi, 3 lines under the Gemara, very important Rashi. L'shitas Beishamai, the Asir, Lahatbil, B'Shabbos, U'B'Yom Tov. Beishamai holds that one may not go to the mikvah, not on Shabbos, not on Yom Tov. Okay, we don't paskin like Beishamai, but that's just to be aware that there's such a shita. However, back in the Mishnah, Beisilo Loimrim, Kalim, Milifnei Shabbos. You're right. If you have a Kali that you want to make Tahar for Yom Tov, you can't do that on Shabbos. You have to do it before Shabbos. But V'Adam, a person is allowed to go to the mikvah on Shabbos. And like Rashi says, we'll learn in the Gemara what's the difference between Kalim and Adam. Now let's learn another din. V'shavin shamashkin es hamayim b'chli even l'taharon. On Shabbos, you can do the only food/drink that is tamei, that is able to become tahar by taking it to the mikvah, only is water. It's normally if food is tamei, it's tamei. Doesn't mean that all food that's tamei is unusable, but it's going to remain tamei. Liquids that become tamei remain tamei. The only exception is mayim. If you have water that became tamei, there is a way to make it tar. How do you do that? You fill up water in a cup. You put the cup inside the mikveh. We're speaking about mikvahs whose waters were not potable or drinkable. So you don't want the waters to mix. But the moment you put it down into the water, and the waters that are around the cup of the mikveh, they touch hashaka, they kiss the waters that are in the keli, it's considered as if it's merged. Sometimes we have the word zriya. It's as if these waters were planted in the mikvah, and these waters become tar. Says the Mishnah that both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that if you want to purify waters for Sunday, Yom Tiv, you are allowed to do that on Shabbos. Now, by the way, he mentions clay even. That's a practical thing because stone utensils cannot become tamei. So, what will be the other option of you putting the water in a, let's say, in a earthenware utensil? And I take that back. Earthenware utensil also cannot be clay cheres cannot become tar. But you have a wooden utensil. If the wooden utensil is tar, you can also do it. But what happens if your utensil is tamei? And since you were told right now that you can be metaher mayim, a person is going to say, you know what? I might as well chapanayin and bring tara to my keli. I'm going to put tamei water in a tamei keli. I'm going to toivel, do hashaka, yachap with the water, and now the keli will become tar. That you're not allowed to do. Says the Mishnah that avoloi matbilin, you may not toivel tamei water. The Gemara will explain in a tamei keli, through it being metayer the keli. You cannot be metayer the keli on Shabbos. You can only be metayer mayim. Make sure the mayim is in a keli that's not tamei. And now the Mishnah concludes by making two statements that will leave for the Gemara. Just read the words. That umadbilen migav legav. You can toivel a keli from one purpose to the other. We'll leave that for the Gemara. And umechabura lechabura, from one group to the other. The Mishnah began with the rule, even lebeis hillel, that allows for a person to go to the mikvah on Shabbos and on Yom Tov, but everyone agrees the kula alma mia that a keli b'Shabbos loy. You may not immerse a keli on Shabbos. Why? Now people are going to say, why? Because you're being mesaken it. I want to just open up. So says the Gemara, Amar Rabba. These are the shas sugyas. Says Rabba Gezeira, turning to Daf Yud Ches, that if a person will be allowed to be metaher kelim on Shabbos, Shema yitlenu biyadoi v'yavirenu arba amayis b'reshus harabim. That if the mikveh is not in your domain, on the way to the mikveh, you're going to end up carrying it. And remember, we already quoted this above. You just quickly look inside the top Tosfos. Like, why are we saying that we are afraid that you're going to transport something dalad amas b'reshus harabim? This kasha is always, why didn't Rabba say that we are afraid that you're going to carry it from a Reshus HaYachad to a Reshus HaRabim? You're going to carry it from your house to the street, to the mikvah. Top Tosfos, Shema Yavrenu, Arba Reshus HaRabim, Tema Mailoi Kamar, Shema Yoitzienu Reshus HaRabim. Maybe do it so. Shloimar, Sheyesh Akeda Bepetach. That we're not afraid that you're going to forget to carry something out of your house. People know, don't walk out of your house with stuff. But if you are in the street and there's no physical boundary, you don't know where the Dalad Amis ends, if you will be allowed to toivel it, there was a fear that you might end up transporting Arba Amis B'Reshus HaRabim. We'll leave it over here, and God willing, to be continued.